A man only locks his heart after something inside it dies. That was what the old bartender used to whisper whenever someone asked about Elias Mercer. And in Dry Creek, everybody asked eventually. Because for 9 long years, Elias had turned down every woman in town without exception. The widowed schoolteacher who brought him peach pie every Sunday. The red-haired saloon singer who once waited outside his ranch in the rain for nearly an hour. Even Abigail Turner, the mayor's daughter with soft blue dresses and enough money to buy half the valley. Elias refused them all the same way. Quietly, politely, like a man closing a door he never intended to open again. Every evening at precisely 7 o'clock, he rode into town beneath the fading Arizona sun, hitched his black horse outside Galloway's saloon, and walked through the swinging doors without looking at anybody. Dust followed him inside every time. The smell of leather, cedar smoke, and cold wind came with him too. Men nodded at him carefully. Women pretended not to watch him. Elias always sat in the farthest corner facing the wall instead of the room, his weathered hat pulled low, a single whiskey glass resting untouched beside his hand for hours at a time. Some folks thought he was arrogant. Others figured he was broken. Truth was, nobody knew for certain. Because Elias Mercer never talked about the winter that changed him. The fire. The grave on the hill outside town. The woman buried beneath frozen dirt while snow covered the coffin before sunrise. Dry Creek learned long ago not to ask questions a man clearly spent years trying to survive. Then came the night the stranger walked in. Wind pushed open the saloon doors hard enough to rattle the windows. Cold air swept through the room carrying the smell of rain and wet pine from the mountains 20 miles north. Conversation slowed. Card players stopped shuffling. Even the piano player missed a note. A woman stood in the doorway wearing a gray traveling dress darkened by snow and road dust. She couldn't have been older than 28. Dark blonde hair pinned loosely beneath a weather-worn hat. Green eyes sharp enough to cut through smoke. She held a small leather suitcase in one hand like she'd been carrying it for days without rest. Every man in the saloon looked at her immediately. Every man except Elias Mercer. That was the first thing Clara Whitmore noticed. The second was the empty chair beside him. She stepped carefully across the wooden floor while boots creaked around her and whiskey glasses clinked softly in nervous hands. A few men straightened their collars as she passed. One cowboy near the poker table smiled too confidently and tipped his hat. Clara ignored him, but as she reached the counter, she glanced once toward the dark corner in the back. Elias still hadn't looked up, not even once. Strange thing was, that hurt more than being stared at. The bartender cleared his throat awkwardly. Passing through, Clara hesitated before answering. Her eyes drifted briefly toward the windows, toward the street outside, like she expected someone to appear there. Maybe, she said softly. Her voice sounded tired. Not weak, just tired in the way people sound after carrying fear too many miles alone. Before the bartender could speak again, the saloon doors creaked open a second time. 2 unfamiliar riders stepped inside wearing long dust coats still wet from melted snow. They weren't loud men. Didn't need to be. One carried himself like someone used to giving orders. The other scanned the room too carefully. Clara saw them instantly. And for the first time since entering the saloon, real fear crossed her face. Small, quick, gone almost immediately, but not fast enough. Because from the shadows near the back wall, Elias Mercer finally lifted his eyes. The taller of the 2 strangers removed his gloves slowly, warming his hands near the stove without asking permission. Snow melted from the shoulders of his coat and dripped onto the saloon floor in heavy drops. His partner stayed near the entrance, pale eyes moving from table to table with the patience of a hunter checking tracks in fresh mud. Nobody in Dry Creek liked men who walked into a room that way. Quiet men were dangerous. Quiet men noticed things. Clara lowered her gaze toward the coffee cup the bartender slid carefully in front of her, but her fingers tightened around the handle hard enough for her knuckles to pale beneath the lantern light. Elias noticed that too. He noticed everything now. The taller stranger finally pulled a folded paper from his pocket and placed it flat against the counter. Looking for somebody, he said calmly. His voice carried eastern polish beneath the trail dust. Not a cowboy, not a rancher. The kind of man who belonged near railroads and bank offices instead of cattle trails and winter storms. The bartender glanced down at the paper. His face changed immediately. Only slightly, but enough. Cannot say I have, he muttered. The stranger smiled without warmth. You did not even look yet. That made the room colder somehow. Clara kept staring into her coffee, though she was no longer drinking it. Elias watched her reflection tremble faintly in the dark liquid. Outside, wind scraped loose snow along the street in thin white ribbons. Somewhere down the road, a horse stomped impatiently against frozen ground. The second stranger stepped farther inside the saloon. His eyes swept across the room once more before settling briefly on Clara's gray dress. Just 1 second. That was all. Then he looked away as if careful not to reveal too much too soon. But it was already enough. Clara stood abruptly. I should go, she whispered. The bartender opened his mouth like he wanted to warn her not to step outside alone, but before he could speak, the taller stranger folded the paper again and turned casually toward her. Miss Whitmore. The sound of her name stopped the entire room cold. Clara froze beside the counter. Slowly, she looked back over her shoulder. Fear lived openly in her eyes now. Not panic. Something deeper. The kind of fear that comes from realizing the road behind you finally caught up. You have traveled a very long way to make this difficult. The stranger continued gently. Mr. Holloway only wishes to bring you home. Clara swallowed hard. Home. She repeated the word like it belonged to somebody else. A few men in the saloon shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Folks in Dry Creek understood many things. A person running from the law. A gambler running from debt. Even a ranch hand disappearing after a bad season. But a woman afraid to return home? That sat differently. Elias finally lifted his whiskey glass for the first time all night. He did not drink from it. He only held it loosely in one rough hand, while watching Clara stand there beneath the lantern glow. Her shoulders stayed straight despite the fear pressing down around her. That mattered to him for reasons he did not fully understand yet. I am not going back, Clara said softly. The second stranger gave a tired sigh. Miss Whitmore, please do not embarrass yourself further. The words landed heavier than shouting would have. Elias saw Clara flinch almost invisibly, like she had heard those words too many times before. The taller man took one slow step toward her. The train leaves south at dawn. We can avoid unpleasantness if you come willingly. Then, from the dark corner near the back wall, a chair scraped softly against old wood. Every head turned. Elias Mercer stood up. Elias Mercer stood slowly, the way old trees move when wind finally becomes strong enough to matter. No sudden motion, no anger on his face. That somehow made the room even quieter. The taller stranger glanced toward him with mild irritation, as if a rancher from some forgotten desert town had interrupted business beneath his station. Elias rested one hand lightly on the back of his chair and looked first at Clara, then at the folded paper still sitting on the counter. Seems the lady already answered you, he said. His voice sounded rough from long silence and cold mornings alone. The stranger offered a patient smile. This matter does not concern you. Elias nodded once like he accepted that. Then he picked up his hat from the table and settled it onto his head. Funny thing about Dry Creek, he said quietly. People around here decide for themselves when they leave. Several men near the poker table exchanged nervous looks. Nobody in town had heard Elias speak that many words at once in years. Clara stared at him in disbelief. Not because he sounded brave, because he sounded tired. Tired in the way men sound when they stop caring what trouble costs them. The second stranger stepped closer. You misunderstand our purpose. Miss Whitmore belongs with her family. Clara's jaw tightened immediately. I am not property. The words slipped out sharper than she intended. A flicker crossed the taller stranger's face before vanishing beneath polished manners. No one said you were, but everybody in the room heard the lie inside it. Outside, wind rattled the saloon windows harder now. Snow spun through the street beneath the weak glow of oil lamps. Somewhere down the block, the church bell rang once against the storm. Elias glanced briefly toward the sound before returning his attention to Clara. Her fingers still gripped the coffee cup, though the drink had gone cold minutes ago. He noticed the faint tremble in her hand. Not weakness. Exhaustion. The kind a person carries after too many nights sleeping with one eye open. Elias knew that feeling better than most. Miss Whitmore, the taller man said again, voice softer now. Mr. Holloway has spent considerable money searching for you. Clara looked down at the counter. That is exactly why I ran. Silence followed that sentence. Heavy silence. The bartender slowly wiped a clean glass that did not need wiping at all. Nobody moved. Even the piano player stared at the keys without touching them. Elias watched Clara carefully. Watched the way she avoided saying too much while fear pressed against her like winter whined through broken boards. She was hiding something deeper than a runaway engagement. He could feel it already. The second stranger finally lost patience. Enough of this. He reached into his coat pocket and removed a small gold watch attached to a chain. The southbound train arrives in 7 hours. You will be on it. Clara stepped back instinctively. Her chair scraped softly across the floorboards. Elias moved before thinking. Just one step. Enough to place himself partly between Clara and the two strangers. Not threatening. Not dramatic. Just there. The taller man studied him for a long moment. You are willing to involve yourself in this woman's mistakes? Elias answered without looking away. I do not know her mistakes. His eyes shifted briefly toward Clara. But I know fear when I see it. Something changed in Clara's expression then. Small. Fragile. Like hearing kindness in a language she had forgotten people still spoke. The storm outside deepened, snow hissing against the windows while lantern light flickered gold across weathered wood and tired faces. Then suddenly came the sound of hooves stopping hard outside the saloon. More riders. More than two this time. The taller stranger smiled faintly toward the door. Looks like our timing just improved. And for the first time in years, Elias Mercer felt the old weight of trouble settling onto his shoulders again. The riders outside did not rush. That was the unsettling part. Men who expected trouble usually moved loud and fast. These men dismounted slowly beneath the falling snow, calm as churchgoers arriving for Sunday service. Through the frosted saloon windows, shadows crossed the white street one by one until 5 dark figures stood outside beneath the lantern glow. Dry Creek had suddenly become too small for comfort. The taller stranger adjusted his cuffs with quiet satisfaction. You see, Miss Whitmore, he said softly, running only makes things more difficult for everyone. Clara did not answer. Her eyes stayed fixed on the door while cold fear slowly crept across her face like moonlight sliding over water. Elias noticed her breathing shorten. He also noticed she had nowhere left to run. That feeling settled inside his chest heavier than he wanted it to. One of the older ranchers near the poker table leaned toward the bartender and whispered, "Who in God's name is this girl?" The bartender only shook his head. Nobody knew. And somehow that made the storm outside feel even colder. The saloon doors opened again, letting in another gust of snow and wind sharp enough to sting skin. A broad man in a dark wool coat stepped inside first, removing leather gloves finger by finger with expensive patience. He looked out of place in Dry Creek. His boots were polished. His beard trimmed carefully. The silver watch chain across his vest gleamed beneath the lantern light. Behind him stood 4 more men, all quiet, all watching. The broad man brushed snow from his sleeve and smiled warmly at Clara like greeting an old friend after a long trip. There you are. Clara's face lost what little color remained in it. Elias saw it happen in real time. Whatever hope she had been holding on to collapsed the moment this man entered the room. The newcomer glanced around the saloon politely before his eyes landed on Elias standing beside her. I was told Western towns valued hospitality, he said pleasantly. Yet somehow my fiancé keeps being hidden from me. Murmurs spread softly through the room. Fiancé. The word changed things. A few men lowered their eyes awkwardly. Others looked toward Clara with uncertainty now. But Elias kept watching only her face. She looked sick hearing the words spoken aloud. I am not your fiancé anymore, Clara said quietly. The broad man sighed as though dealing with a stubborn child. Clara, you disappeared 3 months before the wedding. Your father nearly collapsed from shame. My father sold me, she answered. The room went silent again. Even the wind outside seemed to disappear for one strange second. The broad man's smile tightened only slightly. That is an ugly way to describe a respectable arrangement. Elias felt something cold move through him then. Not anger exactly. Recognition. He had heard men speak that way before. Calm voices hiding ugly truths beneath polished words. Clara wrapped both hands around herself now, as though trying to stay upright. You promised him railroad shares, she whispered. You promised him land and influence. And I promised you security. The broad man stepped closer, lowering his voice carefully. Do you know what kind of life waits for a woman alone out here? Clara laughed softly then. Not because anything was funny. Because she sounded exhausted beyond fear itself. Better than the one waiting back east. Elias watched her shoulders shake once before she steadied herself again. That small moment did something strange to him. For years he had built walls thick enough to survive loneliness, thick enough to survive memory. But standing there beneath the lantern light, watching a tired woman forced to defend her own freedom like it was a crime, something old inside him began waking up against his will. The broad man finally turned toward Elias fully. "You seem like a sensible man," he said. "This matter has nothing to do with you. Let her gather her things, and we leave peacefully before sunrise." Elias looked toward Clara. Snowflakes melted slowly in her hair from when she first entered the saloon. Her suitcase still rested near the counter exactly where she left it. Small, worn, everything she owned in the world sitting inside cracked leather no bigger than 2 feet wide. Elias looked back at the man. Then he spoke quietly enough that the room leaned forward to hear him. "What if she does not want to go?" The question hung inside the saloon like smoke that refused to clear. Nobody moved. Nobody even reached for a drink. The broad man studied Elias Mercer carefully now, no longer seeing just another quiet rancher from a forgotten desert town. Outside, snow drifted harder across Dry Creek, piling against hitching posts and wagon wheels beneath the weak yellow glow of street lanterns. Winter had swallowed the whole town by then. Cold leaked through the walls in thin, invisible fingers. But somehow the saloon felt hotter than before. Clara stared at Elias as though she could not understand why he was still standing there. Most men backed away the moment trouble arrived wearing expensive boots and railroad money. Elias had not moved an inch. The broad man finally smiled again, though the warmth inside it had disappeared completely. "Then she is frightened," he said smoothly. "And frightened people sometimes make foolish choices." Clara let out a bitter breath through her nose. "You always did enjoy deciding what other people feel." One of the men near the poker table quietly stood and slipped toward the staircase leading upstairs. Dry Creek had seen enough tension over the years to recognize when a room might turn dangerous. But Elias remained still beside Clara, one hand resting near the edge of the counter, his eyes calm beneath the brim of his hat. That calmness unsettled people more than anger ever could. The broad man removed his coat slowly and draped it over a chair. "Perhaps introductions would help," he said. "Benjamin Holloway." He extended a hand toward Elias politely. "Owner of Holloway Rail and Western Freight." Elias looked at the hand for a moment, but did not take it. "Elias Mercer." Holloway nodded once. "I have heard the name." That surprised a few people in the room. Elias himself showed no reaction at all. Holloway glanced briefly around the saloon before lowering his voice. "Men who survive grief out here usually fall into one of 2 categories. Drunks or ghosts. I was told you became the second kind." Clara looked sharply toward Elias at those words. But Elias only answered quietly, "People talk too much." Holloway smiled faintly. "Usually because silence frightens them." The bartender suddenly set another coffee cup onto the counter beside Clara. Then, without asking, he filled one for Elias too. The simple gesture changed the room in a strange way. Like the town itself had quietly chosen a side without speaking it aloud. Clara noticed it immediately. So did Holloway. Outside, another gust of wind rattled the windows hard enough to shake loose frost from the corners. The storm was deepening fast. Nobody would be leaving Dry Creek easily tonight. Holloway understood that too. "Listen carefully, Miss Whitmore," he said softly. "The roads are nearly buried already. You are exhausted, cold, frightened. Come back east with me tonight, and by spring this entire unpleasant chapter disappears." Clara lowered her eyes toward the steam rising from her coffee. For one long moment, she said nothing at all. Then quietly, almost too quietly to hear, she answered, "You still think this is about comfort?" Holloway's expression hardened slightly. Clara finally looked up at him fully. "I ran because every room near you felt smaller than a coffin." The words landed heavy against the old wooden walls. Even the men loyal to Holloway shifted uncomfortably now. Elias watched Clara carefully. There was no drama in her voice. No tears. Just exhaustion. The exhaustion of someone who had spent years being politely trapped. Holloway took a slow breath before speaking again. "You are emotional tonight." Elias lifted his coffee cup then, finally drinking something after hours of silence. "No," he said calmly before Clara could answer. "She sounds honest." Holloway turned toward him fully now. "You know nothing about her." Elias looked into the dark coffee for a moment before answering. Maybe. Then his eyes lifted toward Clara again. But I know what it looks like when somebody has been trying to breathe for a very long time. Something inside Clara broke quietly at those words. Not loudly. Not visibly. Just enough for her eyes to lower before anyone could see the sudden shine gathering there. And for the first time in nearly 9 years, Elias Mercer realized he no longer wanted to be left alone. The storm sealed Dry Creek before midnight. Snow buried the road leading south until wagon tracks disappeared beneath smooth white drifts stretching for miles across the valley. Folks in town started locking shutters early, feeding extra wood into stoves, and bringing horses closer to the barns. Winter in Arizona did not come often like that, but when it did, it arrived hard enough to remind people the desert could still kill quietly. Inside Galloway's saloon, nobody seemed eager to move anymore. Holloway and his men occupied one side of the room near the stove while the regulars stayed clustered near the poker tables pretending not to listen. Clara sat beside the counter with both hands wrapped around cooling coffee. Elias remained standing near her shoulder, silent again now, though the silence felt different than before. Less empty, more watchful. Holloway finally checked the silver watch in his vest pocket and sighed. Looks like the weather has decided for us. He slipped the watch away carefully. We leave at first light. Clara stared into her cup. I am not leaving with you. Holloway looked almost disappointed by her stubbornness. You are exhausted, Clara. You are not thinking clearly. Elias spoke before she could answer. Seems clear enough to me. One of Holloway's men muttered something under his breath. Elias did not react outwardly, but Clara noticed his shoulders tighten slightly beneath his worn brown coat. The room had become a place balanced carefully on pride and restraint. Nobody wanted trouble. That was the strange thing. Even Holloway looked less angry then. Determined, like a man trying to reclaim something expensive he believed belonged to him. The bartender finally leaned across the counter toward Clara. Miss, roads are closed tonight anyway. Boarding house upstairs still has one room open. Holloway immediately reached into his coat pocket. I will pay for it. No, Clara answered sharply. The word surprised everyone, including herself. She lowered her voice afterward. I will pay my own way. Holloway studied her quietly for a long moment before stepping back. Fine. But disappointment lingered behind his eyes now. Not heartbreak. Ownership slipping. That was different. The bartender handed Clara a small brass key attached to a faded wooden tag. Room 7. She accepted it carefully, though her fingers brushed the counter hard enough to reveal they were still trembling. Elias noticed that too. He always noticed small things. Clara stood slowly from the stool and picked up her worn leather suitcase. It looked heavier than something so small should have looked. Like the weight inside it had nothing to do with clothes. As she turned toward the staircase, one of Holloway's men shifted slightly, as though considering following her upstairs. Elias moved just enough for the man to stop thinking about it. No threats. No words. Just a quiet reminder that somebody was paying attention. Clara paused halfway toward the stairs. Then she looked back at Elias for the first time without fear clouding her expression. Thank you, she said softly. Elias adjusted his hat slightly. For what? A tired smile touched her lips for half a second. For speaking to me like I belonged to myself. Something in Elias's face changed then. Small enough most people missed it completely. But Clara saw it. So did Holloway. The railroad man leaned back slowly against his chair, studying Elias with renewed interest now, like he had finally identified the real obstacle standing in his path. Clara disappeared upstairs moments later, the old wooden steps creaking softly beneath her boots until silence swallowed the sound completely. Down below, snow hissed against the windows while lantern flames flickered low inside their glass chimneys. Holloway poured himself whiskey but did not drink it immediately. You know, he said calmly toward Elias, people often mistake rescue for love. Elias rested one hand against the counter without looking at him. Did not realize she needed rescuing until tonight. Holloway finally drank from the glass. That is because you met her at the part of the story where she looks innocent. Elias said nothing. Holloway leaned forward slightly, voice softer now. Ask her someday why she really ran. Ask her what happened in St. Louis before she disappeared. Upstairs, a floorboard creaked faintly above them. Elias's eyes lifted toward the ceiling before settling back on Holloway again. And for reasons he could not explain yet, The thought of Clara carrying secrets no longer made him want to walk away. Long after midnight, the saloon finally emptied into the storm, one man at a time. Boots disappeared into deep snow. Lanterns dimmed behind frosted windows across Dry Creek. Even Holloway's men drifted upstairs toward rented rooms, though not before leaving one of their horses saddled beneath the awning outside. Men expecting someone to run did that. Elias noticed. He noticed everything tonight. Galloway wiped down the counter slowly while Elias remained seated near the dying stove, staring into low orange flames that snapped softly beneath iron grates. "You planning to sleep here?" the bartender asked quietly. Elias did not answer immediately. Outside, wind dragged snow across the empty street in silver waves beneath the moonlight. Finally he spoke. "Storm will keep till morning." Galloway nodded once. "Storm outside, maybe." Elias almost smiled at that. Almost. The bartender set a fresh cup of coffee near him before lowering his voice further. "That girl upstairs looks at doors like a hunted animal." Elias rested both hands around the warm cup without drinking. "Yeah. You trust her?" Elias stared into the black coffee for several seconds before answering. "No." Galloway raised an eyebrow. Elias finally looked up. "But I believe her." Strange thing was, he meant it. Trust and belief were not the same thing. Elias had learned that lesson the hardest way possible 9 winters ago. The saloon grew quieter after that. Just wind. Firewood cracking softly. The old clock near the staircase ticking steady through the late hours. Then came the sound of footsteps overhead. Light. Careful. Room 7. Elias's eyes lifted toward the ceiling before he could stop himself. Galloway noticed too, but pretended not to. "You know," the bartender muttered while drying another glass. "Town used to sound like this before your wife died." Elias's jaw tightened slightly. "Do not." Galloway sighed softly. "Just saying you used to look up when people walked in a room." Silence followed. Heavy silence. Elias finally pushed the untouched coffee aside and stood from the chair. "Lock up when you are done." "Where you going?" Elias settled his hat onto his head. "Barn." But he did not go to the barn. Instead, moments later, he found himself standing outside beneath the awning across from the boarding house while snow drifted around his boots in soft white sheets. The cold bit hard enough to numb fingertips within minutes. Still he stayed there watching the second-floor window belonging to room 7. A dim lantern glowed behind the curtain. Clara Whitmore was still awake. Elias could tell somehow. The same way lonely people recognize wakefulness in other lonely people. Across the street, Holloway's horse shifted restlessly beside the hitching rail. One of his men sat nearby beneath heavy blankets pretending to sleep. Watching the building anyway. Elias leaned silently against a wooden post, arms crossed beneath his coat. Half an hour passed. Maybe more. Then suddenly the curtain upstairs moved slightly. Clara stood near the window holding something small in her hands. A photograph perhaps. Even from across the street, Elias could see sadness settle over her shoulders like fresh snow. She remained there only a moment before pulling the curtain closed again. Strange ache moved through Elias's chest after that. Not desire. Not yet. Something quieter. Recognition maybe. He understood what it meant to stand alone in the dark holding pieces of a life that no longer fit anywhere. Wind pushed harder through the street, carrying the distant creak of old signs swinging above. Frozen storefronts. Elias finally turned toward the stable beside the saloon, intending at last to leave this entire mess behind before morning. That was when he heard it. Not screaming. Not panic. Just the soft sound of a window opening upstairs followed by boots landing carefully in snow behind the boarding house. Elias froze. A second later, a shadow slipped between buildings carrying a small leather suitcase. Clara. Alone. Running again. And from farther down the alley, another shadow quietly stepped out to follow her. Clara moved quickly through the narrow alley behind the boarding house, her boots sinking ankle-deep into fresh snow with every hurried step. Wind pulled strands of loose blonde hair across her face, while the small leather suitcase knocked against her leg hard enough to slow her down. She kept glancing over her shoulder anyway. People who spent months running learned to fear footsteps more than exhaustion. Behind a stack of frozen barrels near the stable wall, Elias watched the second shadow trail after her at a careful distance. One of Holloway's men. Tall, thin, patient. The kind of man who knew how to follow somebody without sounding like it. Elias muttered something under his breath and stepped away from the post, boots crunching softly through the snow. Clara reached the back end of the alley where the road split toward the church and freight station. She hesitated there, breathing hard into the freezing dark while lantern light flickered weakly behind frosted windows nearby. For one brief moment, she looked completely lost. Then the shadow behind her finally spoke. "Miss Whitmore." Clara froze instantly. The man stepped forward from the darkness with snow resting along the brim of his hat. "You should not be wandering alone tonight." Clara tightened her grip on the suitcase handle. "Go back inside. Mr. Holloway asked us to keep you safe." She laughed once under her breath. Tired. Bitter. That word again. The man took another slow step toward her. "Please do not make this harder than it already is." Before Clara could answer, another voice drifted through the storm behind them. "Seems to me she already answered twice." Both turned. Sharply. Elias Mercer stood near the alley entrance beneath the weak glow of a hanging lantern, one hand resting inside his coat pocket while snow settled across his shoulders. He looked half-carved from winter itself standing there. Calm. Cold. Impossible to read. The man sighed softly. "Mr. Mercer, this does not concern you." Elias glanced briefly toward Clara before looking back at him. Funny thing. He took another slow step closer. "I keep hearing that." Clara stared at Elias with disbelief and something else now. Something quieter. Nobody had followed her before. Nobody had stepped into trouble simply because she looked afraid. The man adjusted his gloves carefully. "You are risking quite a lot for a woman you met 6 hours ago." Elias's eyes drifted toward Clara's suitcase. The leather was cracked near the corners. One side had been stitched back together by hand. A person carrying that kind of suitcase had already lost enough things. "Maybe," Elias said quietly. "Or maybe some folks get tired of watching people hunted through snow." Wind howled suddenly between the buildings, carrying loose snow across the alley in swirling white clouds. Clara closed her eyes briefly against the cold. When she opened them again, she looked exhausted beyond words. "I cannot stay here," she whispered. "He will never stop looking." Elias studied her face carefully then. The fear there was real, but underneath it lived something stronger. Shame. Like she blamed herself for every mile she had run. The man near her folded his arms impatiently. "Miss Whitmore, the storm alone could kill you before morning." Clara looked down at the snow around her boots. "I know." Silence settled heavily between the three of them. Then Elias spoke again. "My ranch is 12 miles west." Both Clara and the man looked toward him immediately. Elias continued calmly. "No railroad lines. No telegraph office. Storm this bad will cover tracks by sunrise." Clara blinked at him like she had misheard. "Why would you help me?" Elias looked out toward the empty white road disappearing into darkness beyond town. For a long moment, he did not answer. Then quietly he said, "Because somebody should have helped my wife before it was too late." The words hit the cold air like a church bell at midnight. Clara saw pain move behind his eyes before he buried it again beneath silence. The man stepped forward sharply now. "You have no idea what kind of mistake you are making." Elias finally looked directly at him beneath the falling snow. "Maybe not." Then his voice lowered slightly. "But I think she does." And somewhere above the storm, church bells began ringing two slow notes through the sleeping town. The church bells faded into the storm while nobody in the alley moved for several long seconds. Snow drifted between them in thin silver ribbons beneath the lantern light. Clara stood clutching the suitcase against her coat like it contained the last pieces of herself she still trusted. The man following her looked from Elias to the empty white road beyond town and realized something had changed. Elias Mercer was no longer staying out of this. "You are making a personal matter into a public problem," the man warned quietly. Elias shrugged once beneath the falling snow. "Town already has enough problems. One more will not hurt." Clara almost smiled at that despite everything. Almost. The man's patience finally thinned. "Mr. Holloway has influence from here to St. Louis. Judges, sheriffs, railroad men. You think a ranch 12 miles west changes anything?" Elias looked toward the dark horizon beyond Dry Creek where the storm swallowed fences, roads, and mountains alike. "Tonight it does." The answer carried no pride, just certainty. Clara watched the two men carefully while wind tugged hard at her gray coat. For months, she had seen men bend around Benjamin Holloway's money like grass beneath heavy rain. Yet Elias stood there speaking to his people without fear and without anger. Like wealth itself simply failed to impress him. That unsettled her more than she expected. The man finally stepped closer toward Elias, lowering his voice. "You do not know what happened in St. Louis." Elias answered calmly. "No, you do not know what she cost people there." Clara flinched faintly. Elias noticed immediately. "Enough," he said quietly. The man studied Clara for a moment. Before giving a tired sigh, "You should tell him yourself someday." Then he turned and disappeared back through the snow toward the boarding house, boots fading into the storm one slow step at a time. Silence settled over the alley afterward. Just wind. Church bells echoing faintly somewhere far off. Clara stared down at the suitcase in her hands without speaking. Elias remained near the lantern post, giving her distance even now. That mattered too. Men like Holloway always moved closer during silence. Elias stepped back from it instead. "You should not have done that," Clara finally whispered. Elias adjusted the collar of his coat against the cold. "Probably. He will not stop. Most stubborn men do not." Clara let out a soft breath that almost sounded like laughter before exhaustion swallowed it again. Snowflakes melted slowly in her hair. She looked colder now than when she first walked into the saloon hours earlier. Not physically, soul-deep tired. Elias recognized that kind of exhaustion because he had carried it himself for years. "Can you ride?" he asked. Clara blinked slightly at the sudden question. "Yes." "Storm gets worse near dawn. We leave before then." Clara looked toward him carefully. "You are serious." Elias glanced toward the white road leading west. Would not have offered otherwise. She hesitated after that. Elias could almost see the conflict moving behind her eyes. Trusting people had probably become dangerous long before she reached Arizona. Finally, she asked the question quietly. "Why are you really helping me?" Wind pushed hard between the buildings again before Elias answered. 9 years ago, my wife asked somebody for help during a snowstorm." Clara looked up slowly. Elias kept his eyes fixed on the dark road instead of her face. They turned her away because they did not want trouble near their home. The words came flat and steady. That somehow made them hurt more. By morning she was dead 3 miles from town. Clara's grip tightened around the suitcase handle. Elias swallowed once before continuing. "Been a long time since I cared what happened to strangers." He finally looked at her then beneath the falling snow. "But I am not. Watching another person disappear into winter alone." Something inside Clara softened at those words in a way she could not stop. Not romance. Not yet. Just relief so unfamiliar it almost frightened her. For the first time in months, somebody was speaking to her without wanting ownership, obedience, or repayment in return. Just simple human decency. Elias glanced toward the stable beside the saloon. "My horse is saddled already." Clara nodded faintly. Then she looked down at the cracked leather suitcase in her hands and whispered something so quietly the storm nearly carried it away before Elias heard it. "I hope you do not regret this." They left Dry Creek an hour before dawn, while the whole town still slept beneath deep winter snow. Elias rode ahead on his black horse through narrow trails only locals knew, the lantern tied, near the saddle casting weak gold light across drifting white hills and frozen fence lines. Clara followed behind on an older chestnut mare borrowed from Galloway's stable, her gray coat wrapped tightly against the bitter wind. The storm had softened slightly, but cold still cut through leather and wool like sharpened glass. Neither of them spoke much during the first few miles. Hooves crunched steadily through snow while dark pine trees leaned over the trail like silent witnesses watching them disappear westward into the storm. Clara kept expecting to hear riders behind them. Every gust of wind sounded like pursuit now. Elias noticed the way she glanced back every few minutes. "Nobody could track us in this weather," he finally said without turning around. Clara lowered her eyes. "Benjamin Holloway does not usually stop because something is difficult." Elias nodded once. "Neither does winter." The faintest smile touched Clara's face before fading again. Dawn slowly pushed pale gray light across the desert horizon as they reached higher ground west of town. Snow covered the Arizona plains in a way Clara had never seen before, softening the harshness of the land until even dead trees looked almost peaceful beneath the ice. Elias finally slowed near a narrow ridge overlooking a frozen creek bed below. "We rest the horses here." Clara dismounted carefully, boots sinking several inches into untouched snow. Her legs trembled slightly from cold and exhaustion the moment she hit the ground. Elias pretended not to notice and began loosening straps near the horses instead. That kindness mattered more than sympathy. Clara stood near the ridge staring out across the white valley while wind carried the smell of cedar and distant smoke through the morning air. Somewhere far off, a lone hawk circled slowly above the canyon cliffs. "It is beautiful," she whispered. Elias glanced toward the horizon. "Looks different in summer." Clara laughed softly beneath her breath. "I think everything looks different to people who belong somewhere." Elias paused at those words. Then quietly he asked, "You ever belong anywhere?" Clara wrapped both arms around herself against the cold. "Not really." Silence settled between them again. Not uncomfortable this time. Just quiet. Elias removed a small metal flask from his saddlebag and handed it toward her. "Coffee." Clara accepted it carefully, surprised by the warmth still trapped inside. "You planned this." Elias adjusted a saddle strap without looking up. "Planned on leaving town before sunrise anyway." Clara studied him over the rim of the flask. "That is not true." Elias finally looked toward her then. Snow drifted slowly between them, while pale morning light touched the tired lines beneath his eyes. Clara realized something strange in that moment. Elias Mercer did not know how to lie very well. Not about important things. "Why stay alone all these years?" she asked softly. Elias rested one arm against the saddle and stared toward the frozen creek below. For a while he said nothing at all. Clara thought he might ignore the question completely. Then finally he answered, "After my wife died, people treated me carefully." His voice stayed calm, but distant somehow, like grief was something contagious. Clara listened quietly. Elias continued, "Women brought pies to the ranch. Men invited me fishing. Folks tried real hard to make me feel alive again." A bitter smile touched his mouth briefly. "Only problem was I did not want to be alive again." Wind moved softly through the pine trees nearby. Clara lowered the flask slowly. "What changed?" Elias looked at her for a long moment after that. Long enough for something quiet and dangerous to pass between them beneath the falling snow. Then he looked away first, still figuring that out. Before Clara could answer, both horses suddenly lifted their heads sharply toward the eastern ridge behind them. Elias's expression changed instantly, calm disappearing beneath focus. He stepped toward the edge of the hill and narrowed his eyes against the pale morning light. Far behind them, barely visible through drifting snow, dark figures moved slowly along the trail they had used less than an hour earlier. Riders. Clara felt the warmth leave her face immediately. Elias stared at the distant shadows for one long second before speaking quietly. "Looks like somebody found our tracks after all." Elias mounted his horse again without another word. The quietness in his face had changed now. Less reflective. Sharper. Clara watched him scan the white horizon with the same focus men used when storms rolled in too fast across open country. The riders behind them still looked distant through the drifting snow, but they were moving steadily west. "Following." "How many?" Clara asked softly. Elias narrowed his eyes toward the ridge. "3, maybe 4. Clara looked down immediately. "I am sorry." Elias reached for the reins calmly. "Does not matter." "It should." Wind pushed hard against her coat, while guilt crept visibly across her face. "You gave me a way out, and I turned your life into this." Elias looked at her for a long second before answering. Life was already this. Clara frowned slightly. Elias adjusted the saddle strap on the chestnut mare. Quiet does not always mean peaceful. The words settled heavily between them as they rode deeper into the western hills. Snow covered the trails unevenly now, exposing patches of frozen dirt and jagged stone beneath the horses' hooves. The land had grown rougher. Narrow canyon walls rose around them in dark red cliffs streaked with ice, while cedar trees twisted from the rocks like stubborn old ghosts refusing to die. Clara stayed close behind Elias through the winding passes, though she could still feel fear riding beside her with every mile. By noon, the storm finally weakened enough for pale sunlight to break through the clouds in thin silver beams. Elias guided the horses toward a small cabin tucked beneath the cliffs near a frozen creek. Smoke no longer rose from the chimney. Time and weather had nearly swallowed the place whole. "Whose cabin is this?" Clara asked quietly. Elias dismounted first. "Used to belong to an old trapper named Amos Reed." He brushed snow from the porch railing with one gloved hand. "Passed 2 winters ago." Clara climbed carefully from the mare, legs stiff from hours riding through cold mountain air. The cabin door creaked open beneath Elias's hand, revealing dust, old blankets, and the faint smell of cedar buried beneath years of silence. Strange thing was, it still felt warmer than anywhere Clara had slept in months. Elias moved inside automatically, checking windows and feeding fresh wood into the iron stove near the wall. Clara set her suitcase gently beside the door and watched him in silence. He knew how to survive loneliness too well. That realization stayed with her while flames slowly came alive inside the stove, filling the cabin with soft orange light and crackling warmth. "You have done this before," she said quietly. Elias glanced toward her while removing his gloves. "What?" "Disappear." He looked back, toward the fire, instead of answering directly. "Sometimes staying in one place too long makes people think they own pieces of you." Clara lowered her eyes at that. Outside, wind rattled against the cabin walls while snow slid softly from the roof in heavy clumps. For the first time since leaving St. Louis, she no longer felt hunted every second. Exhausted, yes. Afraid, still. But the fear had loosened slightly around her throat. Elias handed her a folded blanket from a nearby chair. "Get warm." Clara accepted it carefully. Their fingers brushed for half a second. Nothing dramatic happened. No sudden romance. Just warmth. Real warmth after months of cold strangers and careful lies. That somehow felt more dangerous. Elias moved toward the small shelf beside the stove, searching through old tins and supplies left behind by the trapper. Clara watched him quietly before finally speaking again. The man outside the saloon was right about one thing. Elias looked over his shoulder. Clara swallowed once. "You really do not know what happened in St. Louis." The room fell silent except for crackling firewood. Elias rested one hand against the shelf, but did not interrupt her. Clara stared down at the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. "My father owed Benjamin Holloway money long before I met him." Her voice sounded distant now, like she hated remembering any of it. "When the railroad expanded east, Holloway offered to erase the debt." Elias already knew where the story was heading. Clara continued anyway. "In exchange, he wanted me." Elias's jaw tightened faintly. Clara looked toward the fire. At first everyone called it a blessing. Rich husband. Big house. Safety. Her laugh came quietly after that. Empty. Funny thing about cages. They always look comfortable from the outside. Elias said nothing. But for the first time since she met him, Clara noticed anger moving quietly behind his eyes. The fire burned low by evening while snow continued falling outside the cabin in slow, heavy sheets. Wind moved through the canyon with a sound almost human at times, soft and mournful against the rocks. Clara sat near the stove wrapped in the old wool blanket while Elias repaired a loose leather strap beside the window with quiet hands practiced by years alone. Neither of them spoke for a long while after her confession. Some truths changed the shape of a room once spoken aloud. Finally, Clara broke the silence herself. "You think I should have stayed?" Elias kept working without looking up. "No," Clara frowned slightly. "Most people do." Elias pulled the strap tighter between rough fingers. "Most people have never lived inside a cage they could not see." The words settled deep inside her. Clara stared into the fire afterward, watching orange light flicker across old cabin walls scarred by weather and time. "Benjamin never shouted," she whispered quietly. That was the strange part. Elias listened without interrupting. "He bought dresses I never asked for. Hired musicians for dinners I did not want to attend. Every decision already made before I entered the room." Her hands tightened around the blanket. "People looked at me like I should feel grateful all the time." Elias finally lifted his eyes toward her. Clara laughed softly beneath her breath, though sadness lived inside every sound. "One night I realized I had not chosen a single thing for myself in almost 3 years." Outside, wind pushed snow hard against the cabin windows. Elias set the leather strap aside slowly. "So you ran?" Clara nodded once. The morning invitations for the wedding arrived. She looked down toward the cracked suitcase resting near the door. "I left before sunrise with $40 and my mother's photograph." Elias followed her gaze toward the suitcase. Strange how an entire life could shrink small enough to carry by hand. "Why Arizona?" he asked quietly. Clara looked toward the fire again. "Because nobody searches for lost society women in the desert." Elias almost smiled at that. Almost. Silence settled gently between them afterward. Not heavy this time. Warm somehow. The kind of silence lonely people create when they stop pretending around each other. Then suddenly the horses outside shifted sharply. Elias's expression changed immediately. He stood and crossed toward the window in 3 quick steps, pulling the curtain aside slightly. Clara rose from her chair at once. "What is it?" Elias stared into the dark canyon beyond the cabin. Snow drifted across the rocks in pale waves beneath fading evening light. At first Clara saw nothing. Then movement. Shadows. Riders appearing slowly along the ridge above the frozen creek. 4 of them this time. Maybe 5. Her stomach tightened instantly. "How?" she whispered. Elias let the curtain fall closed again. Storm slowed down near noon. Calm voice. Sharp eyes. Already thinking. Clara moved toward the suitcase near the door automatically. "I should leave." Elias looked at her like the idea itself irritated him. "In a blizzard? They came because of me." "Yeah." He reached for his coat hanging near the wall. "That means you stay inside." Clara stared at him in disbelief. "You cannot. Face them alone." Elias slid his gloves on slowly, not planning to fight anybody. The fire crackled softly behind them while wind groaned through the canyon outside. Clara stepped closer. "Benjamin will not stop." Elias looked toward the door while fastening his coat. "Neither will Winter." The same words from earlier, but heavier now. Clara watched him carefully. Something had changed in him since Dry Creek. The loneliness still existed. The grief too. But now another feeling lived beside it. Purpose. He was protecting something again for the first time in years, and that frightened him almost as much as the riders outside. Clara lowered her voice. "Why are you really doing this?" Elias paused beside the door without turning around. Snow hissed softly against the cabin roof overhead. Then quietly he answered, "Because somebody should have stood between my wife and the storm." Clara felt her throat tighten immediately. Elias rested one hand against the doorframe before continuing. "I was too late then." He finally looked back at her. Firelight flickered across his tired face while cold wind slipped through the cracks in the cabin walls. "I am not being too late twice." Then before Clara could stop him, Elias Mercer opened the cabin door and stepped alone into the falling snow. Snow swirled hard through the canyon as Elias stepped away from the cabin porch and into the fading evening light. The riders waited near the frozen creek below, their horses restless beneath drifting white wind. Benjamin Holloway sat at the front wrapped in a dark wool coat dusted with snow, calm as ever, though his pale eyes fixed immediately on Elias standing alone outside the cabin. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Wind carried softly through the cedar trees while somewhere high above the cliffs, a hawk cried once against the darkening sky. Holloway finally dismounted slowly, boots sinking into fresh snow. "You continue making this harder than necessary," he said calmly. Elias rested one hand against the porch railing. "Funny. Feels pretty simple from where I stand." Holloway glanced briefly toward the cabin windows glowing warm behind him. "You think hiding her out here changes anything?" Elias looked toward the frozen creek below before answering. "No." Holloway frowned slightly at the honesty. Elias continued quietly. "But maybe it changes her life for a little while." Snow drifted between them in soft white waves. Holloway removed one glove finger by finger, the way wealthy men always did things slowly because they expected the world to wait for them. "You know what happens next," he said. "The storm ends. The railroad reaches Arizona by spring. People like me always find people like her eventually." Elias nodded once. "Probably." Holloway studied him carefully now. "Then why keep standing there?" Elias looked toward the cabin door behind him. Firelight flickered softly through the cracks in the old wood while wind rattled against the roof overhead. "Because she asked for a life that belonged to her." Holloway sighed quietly. "You speak like freedom feeds people." Elias finally looked directly at him beneath the falling snow. "Maybe not." His voice lowered slightly. "But cages starve them." Silence settled over the canyon after that. Holloway's men shifted uneasily on horseback while snow piled against saddle leather and frozen stone. Then the cabin door creaked softly open behind Elias. Clara stepped outside wrapped in the old wool blanket, pale winter light touching her tired face. Holloway's expression changed immediately seeing her again. Not love, possession returning. Clara noticed it too. She walked slowly onto the porch until she stood beside Elias beneath the falling snow. Holloway took one careful step forward. "Clara." She shook her head before he could continue. "No, The single word echoed softly across the frozen creek. Holloway stared at her in disbelief. Clara's voice trembled slightly when she spoke again, but not from fear this time. For 3 years I listened to everyone tell me what my life should look like. Snowflakes melted against her blonde hair, while tears gathered quietly in her eyes. I cannot do it anymore. Holloway's face hardened slowly beneath the winter wind. You think this man can protect you forever? Clara looked sideways toward Elias then. He still stood silent beside her, coat covered in snow, saying nothing at all. Strange thing was, she trusted silence more than promises now. No, she whispered honestly. But he never asked me to belong to him. The canyon went completely still after that. Even Holloway seemed caught off guard by the answer. Elias looked toward Clara quietly, something deep and painful shifting behind his tired eyes. 9 years of grief. 9 years of silence. And somehow this exhausted woman standing beside him had reached places inside him he thought winter buried forever. Holloway finally lowered his gaze. For the first time since arriving in Dry Creek, he looked old. Just an aging man losing something money could not force back into his hands. After a long silence, he pulled his gloves back on slowly. You are making a mistake, he said quietly. Clara wrapped the blanket tighter around herself against the cold. Maybe. Then she looked toward the dark western mountains beyond the canyon. But this one is finally mine. Holloway stared at her a few seconds longer before turning away toward his horse. One by one, the riders followed him back through the falling snow until darkness swallowed them completely beyond the ridge. The storm softened sometime after midnight. By morning, sunlight spilled gold across the frozen canyon, while smoke rose gently from the old cabin chimney. Inside, 2 coffee cups rested beside the stove. And for the first time in nearly a decade, Elias Mercer no longer sat alone in silence.